Gotcha.
They had
Okay.
a settler colonial project in mind, and the
Okay.
first stage of that was purchase. Their plan was to purchase enough land,
Hmm.
then kick out the Arabs from that land, and once they were strong enough to build an army and then do the rest. And there are explicit quotes about this.
So if I don't understand, if the goal was, if it was always to kick out the Arabs, this is a complaint
Mhm.
that's often lodged against early Zionists. Why is it in 47? Why did they accept a partition plan that would have had 45% of their population being Palestinians?
Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wassalam ala rasulillah. Alright, let's just circle back to Javad's point. Javad said that there was always a plan to kick out the Arabs. That's a statement about intentionality, that is, the intention of the settlers. Destiny's response to that is to ask, well, why would they then be accepting of partition plans that have a 45% Palestinian demographic? The implication of Destiny's question is that they wouldn't be accepting of such partition plans if there was always a plan to kick out the Arabs. That's what his question implies. But is that really the case? Isn't formally accepting such partition plans only to achieve some end consistent with maintaining an intention to kick out the Arabs? Clearly, it's not only logically consistent, but also practically consistent with such an aim. If they wish to use such deals as a stepping stone to the ultimate aim of establishing a Jewish state, then of course it's consistent that, on account of pragmatic concerns, momentary acceptance of whatever else comes with such deals makes sense. They can't expect to achieve all their aims at once, right? So it still is the case they could be holding on to this long-term desire to kick out the natives while simultaneously agreeing to partition plans with whatever demographics.
Yeah. So the reason that it's a silly argument is, number one, is you base this first on the argument that they even really accepted the UN partition plan. They tactically accepted the British partition, the UN partition plan, but they always rejected all of the details of it, other than the fact that it gives them Israeli state from which they can expand. So they didn't accept the borders, and they didn't accept the demography. In fact, we have explicit quotes, not just from, and I've seen what you've discussed with Loner Box, it's not just the 1937 partition plan, but it's also 1947, where they said that they're not going to accept these aspects. And when here I'll give you the explicit quotes. Here's David Ben Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, December 3rd, 1947. Every school child knows that there is no such thing in history as a final arrangement, not with regard to the regime, not with regard to the borders, and not with regard to international agreements. History, like nature, is full of alterations and change. This is from David Ben Gurion's War Diaries, December 3rd, 1947.
Why is he saying that?
Okay.
What's the point of saying something like that?
The point is that he always has in mind that he's going because the other Zionists didn't want to accept the partition plan because they wanted all of historical Palestine.
Correct. That's right.
Yes.
He has to have these ideas
because
he has
David
to try
Ben
to sell.
Gurion.
Yes, he has to have these ideas because he has to sell to the Jews there, hey, we need to accept this partition plan. Listen, I know that you are upset about accepting this now, and it seems like not much, but hey, listen, history is before us. Who knows what will happen in the future? So what you just quoted in his example of them accepting the partition plan, they did. Now, if you want, we could try to roll with a historical counterfactual that, well, maybe in the future they would have broken it, but since the Arabs rejected it outright, we'll never know. So it is the fact that they did indeed accept the partition plan in 47. They did, and the Arabs didn't. Like, they accepted the borders, they accepted the demography.
Did Destiny miss what Javad said at the beginning of his response?
You base this first on the argument that they even really accepted the UN partition plan. They tactically accepted the British partition, the UN partition plan.
They tactically accepted it. So I don't know why he did this kind of eureka motion with his hands while Javad was reading the quote, like Destiny discovered some new information. As if Javad didn't already say at the outset that they tactically did accept the partition plan. So let's just recap the discussion so far. Destiny's inference is that if they wanted to kick them out, then they wouldn't be accepting of these kinds of plans, but they did accept such a plan, so that means that they didn't want to kick them out. In response to this inference, Javad highlights a distinction between a good faith acceptance and one done as like a strategic maneuver. He uses the words really accepted and tactically accepted. And then he further makes the claim that, they did it as a tactical acceptance. And he supports this claim with the Ben Gurion quote, where Ben Gurion is addressing his fellow Zionists using words like, there's no such thing as a final arrangement. So that kind of hints to the fact that the intentionality of the Zionists are not in line with whatever stipulations are in the partition plan, such as they are.
So it is the fact that they did indeed accept the partition plan in 47. They did, and the Arabs didn't. Like, they accepted the borders, they accepted the demography.
So this is just ignoring Javad's point was to do with the motivation for the acceptance, which is at the crux of the issue, right? Because they're disputing whether they wanted to kick out the Arabs or not. Destiny just reasserts that because they accepted the plan, therefore they honestly accepted its tenets. So it's just plainly not interacting with the counter argument in any way. Just to be clear, I want to make this super clear. This counter evidence from Javad doesn't really do much to show that there was a desire for ethnic cleansing. What it does is undermine the claim that mere acceptance of such plans is enough to establish honest intent behind their tenets. Now, to counter that, Destiny would have needed to show something like that there is evidence to show acceptance was good faith. Perhaps there is. I don't know. But the point is that Destiny didn't provide any evidence of it. Or perhaps Destiny could have gone the route of saying that such statements from Ben-Gurion are not representative of Zionist thought. But he didn't do any of that. He just reasserted his position because he wants to smuggle in intentionality behind the face value acceptance of the plan.
Let's go through the evidence. David Ben-Gurion has multiple quotes where he says, quote, "A Jewish state in part of Palestine is not an end, but a beginning. Through this, we increase our power, and every increase in power."
I'm so sorry, and I don't mean to be disrespectful. I don't know what your major, your concentration is for your PhD.
Okay, college dropout.
Why do you think it's acceptable to give me one quote as a rejection of the argument that I just gave? I just told you that the Israeli people, they accepted it. Multiple quotes is not an argument, sir. You need to show me that they rejected at the UN. Did they reject the partition plan? Did they accept Resolution 181, or did they reject it? They accepted it. We can go and we can read the UN logs. We can look at them.
Oh my God, this guy's so dumb, I swear. What a mess, right? What a mess. So he says that you need to show that at the UN they rejected the partition plan of 47. No, he doesn't. Why does he need to do that? And then he has the audacity to object to Javad's quotes because he's just not understanding what they're targeting. Because I think he actually forgot what was the initial contention that caused this dispute. The initial contention was whether or not there was an intention to kick out the Arabs, right? And to that end, the only inference that the partition plan could have to that end is with this above argument, right? And these quotes don't attack premise 2 because Javad agrees with you. They accepted the partition plan. He says they accepted it tactically, right? But they accepted it nonetheless, right? So he's not attacking premise 2 with these quotes. He's attacking premise 1, okay? Because as the quotes show, they could be approaching these partition plans and accepting them for reasons that have nothing to do with the demographics, right? In other words, with regards to P1, they could have the intent to expel the Arabs while also accepting such partition plans. So that would be a case in which P1 is false. If P1 is false, then the argument is unsound. Clear?
So my argument wouldn't allow that because I'm saying that they did accept it deceitfully. So
maybe they did, but they did accept it.
We know that
they accepted it, right? Then they did accept it.
This, for me, is the proof that he really did forget the contention. Because if you're willing to grant that they accepted it deceivingly, then you can't use the acceptance to say that they didn't want to kick out the Arabs because the whole thing would have been motivated by deceit.
So remember when you said that in a previous debate, you talked about Yasser Arafat being deceitful about Oslo Accords, right? So there, for you, all of a sudden, his deceit, supposedly, which you were wrong about on that point, but let's say that he was being deceitful and saying something else to Arabs or Muslims somewhere else, that is factually relevant to you. But here it's not.
It is, but I would never say they didn't accept the Oslo Accords. They did accept the Oslo Accords. Now, he might have been deceitful, he did it, but they accepted it.
Didn't you hear me say that they tactfully accepted it?
That's fine, but then that doesn't. But if they accepted it even tactfully, if they did it in a sneaky manner, then the Arabs rejected it. That's true.
Okay, so what? This is just a change of subject. What does it have to do with kicking out the Arabs? He's completely lost the plot. So I think we've covered the partition plan argument enough at this point. The takeaway is that whether or not they accepted these plans tells us basically nothing about whether ethnic cleansing was ever on the agenda. Javad's evidence gives us good reason to think that the acceptance wasn't genuine. So Destiny's whole point about the acceptance being tied to not wanting to kick out the Arabs falls apart. But what the evidence doesn't show is that expulsion was ever the end goal, right? That's still an open question at this point in the debate. And to touch on that aspect, I want to bring back this quote Javad was reading from before Destiny interrupted him. A Jewish state in part of Palestine is not an end, but a beginning. Our possession is important not only for itself, through this we increase our power, and every increase in power facilitates getting hold of the country in its entirety. Establishing a small state will serve as a very potent lever in our historical efforts to redeem the whole country. So this is just more evidence that they had little regard for the actual tenets of whatever plans they were signing onto. But what's interesting is that these comments were actually made about the 1937 partition plan. And just to recap a little bit about the history of the 1937 partition plan, before 1937, there were often private and public discussions between the various stakeholders of Palestine, mainly Zionists, about the idea of partition. And after the Arab revolts, which kind of momentarily ceased around 1937-ish, a commission report was issued by the British, what's known as the Peel Commission Report, which recommended a plan of partition between the natives and the settlers. Okay, fine, but why am I saying all this and what does it have to do with expulsion? Well, the 1937 partition plan was even more relevant because the area that was proposed as part of this plan to be the Jewish area actually had a larger Arab population than there were Jews. So you can't really even call that area Jewish, right, if there's not even a critical Jewish mass. Thus, along with this Peel Commission report's proposed partition, there was also a proposed population transfer of the Arabs out of the proposed Jewish area. This was the first time acknowledging in a potentially politically backed public forum that there's going to be a need of a transfer of Arabs. The implication of this transfer is that there's going to be either a voluntary exodus of Arabs or one forced upon them. In other words, they're going to have to be kicked out. And what did these leading Zionists have to say about this aspect of the plan? What did Ben-Gurion have to say about it? Well, he wrote this to his son. We never wanted to dispossess the Arabs, but since England is giving part of the country promised to us for an Arab state, it's only fair that the Arabs in our state be transferred to the area. Right? So he's all reluctant about it, right? It's an unfortunate corollary of our desire to establish a Jewish state, but if it's a blocker to Zionism, then they'll have to go. My sources for pretty much all these quotes are from historian Benny Morris's book Righteous Victims, where he basically makes the case that this was a well-known problem for Zionists. If you want to establish a Jewish state in an area where every direction you look you see Arabs, well then some drastic change has to occur. And he can make the case better than I ever could, so this is Morris. The transfer idea did not originate with the Peel Commission. It goes back to the fathers of modern Zionism and, while rarely given a public airing before 1937, was one of the main currents in Zionist ideology from the movement's inception. It was always clear to the Zionists that a Jewish state would be impossible without a Jewish majority. This could theoretically be achieved through massive immigration, but even then the Arabs would still be a large threatening minority. For many Zionists, beginning with Herzl, the only realistic solution lay in transfer. Following the outbreak of 1936, no mainstream leader was able to conceive of future coexistence and peace without a clear physical separation between the two peoples, achievable only by way of transfer and expulsion. Moreover, transfer was seen as a highly moral solution. The Zionist leaders felt that the Jews' need for a country with empty spaces able to absorb future immigrants morally outweighed the rights of the indigenous Arabs. But Palestine's Arabs did not wish to evacuate the lands of their ancestors, and they made this very clear. What else can I say? I think that's good enough for now. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.